We have a very special episode of Defending Democracy. I'm going to be talking to Judge Michael Luttig, who, as you all know, was one of the heroes of the January 6th Commission and has been a clear voice for democracy ever since. But before I do, I want to take this opportunity to remind you that Democracy Docket is running a membership sale with $20 off its usual price for membership. Click on the link above or in the show notes below to take advantage of this limited time offer, which expires on Tuesday. Judge Luttig, welcome to Defending Democracy.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be on with you today.
So I want to start with something that happened very, very recently, and that is Donald Trump, who has been an expert in making irresponsible statements, made what has to have been probably the most irresponsible statement, at least in his recent run here. And that is a specific attack he made on Liz Cheney, in which he suggested that she stand with a rifle in front of 9 barrels shooting at her. It was clearly, in my view, an allusion to a firing squad. And I'm just curious what your take on that is.
Mark, those were vile comments by the former president. That said, they are of the same cloth with almost every comment the former president has made for the past 4 years and even during his presidency. As you and your viewers and listeners know, the former president has suggested that the former Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, should be executed. At this point, there are just no words really to describe the reprehensibility of the statements by the former president. But the tragedy for America is that the worse the statement that he makes, the greater support he gets from his base and the Republican Party. It's worth reminding people that never before in American history has one president said even one thing like Donald Trump says every day of his life. I've tried over the past couple of years to help Americans understand how unprecedented not just the conduct, but the rhetoric of Donald Trump is. At this point, one of the greatest tragedies for the country is that Donald Trump's conduct and his rhetoric have become normalized into American society and American political culture.
And I'm just curious why you think that is. I have been asked this question 1,000 times, if not more, and I don't really have a good answer for it. Why, at various points, it has felt like the Republican Party and others have had an opportunity to break with him and sort of end the madness and the chaos. And yet, at each stage that you think that break may take place, it doesn't take place. I'm just curious if you have a theory as to why this continues.
Well, I do, Mark, and it's the obvious one to all of us at this point. 4 years thence from January 6, 2021, and of course the explanations vary people to people, but our Republican officials, I believe and have said publicly, are they're moral and political cowards, not without good reason, because the world knows at this point if you cross Donald Trump and you're a public official or an elected political official, he has the power within the Republican Party literally to ruin your political career. as he has attempted to do with Liz Cheney, who is his foremost nemesis, I would guess. But that takes me back to your initial question about the comments made as to Congresswoman Cheney. For inexplicable reasons, Donald Trump has decided that his closing argument to the American people is that he's going to avenge his enemies from within. That is, our fellow Americans, Mark, yours and my fellow Americans and friends, but his fellow Americans. You know, he's promised to exact revenge against a large swath of America and many Americans, Republican and Democrat alike. You know, you and I are old enough to remember, I think, probably the most basic rule of politics, which is no politician can afford to alienate a single vote. And, the corresponding fact is that every politician is always seeking every single vote, even from their political opponents.
Yep.
Not Donald Trump. He's gone to the opposite end of the political spectrum and has very deliberately purged, even from the Republican rosters, anyone and everyone that he believes is not faithful to him and his policies, whatever his policies are. And of course, at this point, he has none.
Yeah, and what really, I think it's important that all of our viewers realize, and I know this, I followed your career long before when you were on the bench. What people don't realize is that you were chosen by Mike Pence to advise him, in part because you are one of the leading luminaries in the conservative legal movement. You clerked for then Judge Scalia, I assume, on the DC Circuit. You clerked for Chief Justice Warren Burger, who was a conservative Chief Justice. You worked in the Reagan White House. You worked in the H.W. Bush DOJ before you were nominated to be put on the federal bench. And so when people hear you sound these alarms, you come at this from a standpoint, I would think, from enormous credibility from the right. And I'm just curious, what do your fellow conservative thinkers, make of all of this, particularly in the legal establishment, as they have witnessed this?
Well, Mark, I've, of course, never been a political partisan, though I've always been a Republican. But I've always been a proud Republican and an even prouder conservative. And I've said in recent weeks, and then I just tweeted this morning as sort of my final statement before tomorrow's election, that Donald Trump is not a Republican or a conservative. And I think I first articulated that line on Friday afternoon in an interview with Nicole Wallace on Deadline White House, when Nicole asked me, what is the explanation, or what would you say, as it were, to the Bill Barrs of the world and others who have spoken as derogatively about the former president from firsthand experience as anyone in the country, has and could, but nonetheless intend to vote for him. And I said to Nicole on Friday, I would say to those people, come to your senses. Donald Trump is not a Republican. Donald Trump is not a conservative. And if your loyalty is to the Republican Party and to conservatism, then you should have no allegiance to this man whatsoever. He has transformed in his own image the Republican Party, and that's why it's really the Donald Trump MAGA Party. It's not the Republican Party that the country's known for almost the past 250 years.
So then why do you think so many conservative lawyers and the conservative legal establishment has gone along with him?
Well, look, Mark, it's obvious why they have, but let's begin with the fact that they, in order to continue to support the former president, of necessity, they have to abandon and jettison all of their prior held political views and moral views and views about the values upon which this country was founded. I know you're a Democrat, or I think you are, but we both know that the Republican Party has always, proudly positioned itself as the party that stood for America's values and the Constitution of the United States. In order to embrace Donald Trump at this point, you cannot have it both ways. And so those people who have continued to support him have necessarily put their own moral values and principles and the moral values and principles of the United States of America behind their support for Donald Trump, which is to say, the only explanation possible is that either they are doing so, supporting him out of their own self-interest, or they are regarding this election as simply the next presidential election in which two equally positioned candidates have different and opposing policy views for the country. That's not what the election tomorrow is about. The election tomorrow is about anything but the respective policy differences between the two candidates. But that's been you could call it the political genius of Donald Trump, but I will not call it that because I think it's corruption. But he has succeeded in convincing the Republicans, certainly, if not other Americans, that nothing he has done in the past 4 years, beginning with January 6th and his attempt to overturn an election, and that he lost fair and square to Joe Biden, matters one whit. So that's why you have a candidate in Donald Trump who's been in charge by the United States of America with the gravest possible offenses that an incumbent president could commit under the Constitution of the United States. And those people who support him, including many, many Republican officials, they think that's just fine. I don't.
Yeah. And you deserve an enormous amount of credit for your courage and your convictions on that. I have to ask you, because you are, in fact, one of the leading scholars of the Constitution, one of the leading scholars and people who understand the working of the federal court system, including the U.S. Supreme Court. So I get asked all the time about the Supreme Court, and I tell them, and it's usually from people on the left who are very concerned about the Supreme Court and what it will mean in the upcoming election. What I tell folks is the following. First of all, there have certainly been rulings by the Supreme Court that I disagree with. I thought the decision around the immunity case was wrong. I thought that the 14th Amendment case out of Colorado was not properly analyzed. But I also point out that the Supreme Court walked back from the brink in Moore v. Harper, a case that you commented a lot about and talked about its importance. The Supreme Court, refused the opportunities given to it to interject itself into the election after 2020. Just the other day, the Supreme Court denied an emergency petition out of Pennsylvania and refused to intervene there. I know this is a lot of tea leaf reading, but what do you tell people who ask you about how to think about the Supreme Court as we head towards the election?
Well, the charitable implications of that series of questions, Mark, if that is what it was, and I don't suggest that it necessarily was, I don't agree with it all. So let's start with the 2020 presidential election. Had the Supreme Court of the United States taken the independent state legislature case out of Pennsylvania, or one of the others, there would have never been a January 6th in the first place. But of course, back at the time, in the first week or two of December, the court declined to take review of that and those cases, and it was a split vote. And some number of the justices, 3 or 4, depending on how you look at their opinions, clearly suggested that they believed in the independent state legislature theory. But in all events, it's worse than to no credit that the court didn't take that case. It was an abdication of their responsibility, because at that point, you, I, many others were worried about what would happen on January 6th if that issue hasn't been decided. And that's for the obvious reason that the independent state legislature theory was the centerpiece of the plan to overturn the election. So fast forward then to the disqualification case, Anderson against Trump out of Colorado. The Supreme Court just refused to decide the case.
Yeah.
It didn't decide it wrongly. It just refused to decide it.
Right.
This is exactly what we have a Supreme Court of the United States to do, is to decide the most fundamental questions facing America when the time comes. And our Supreme Court just said, no, we're just not going to decide this under any circumstance. And it was an embarrassment to the court. And as you know, Larry Tribe, my good friend Larry Tribe, and I called that a betrayal of the Constitution and a betrayal of America. So then fast forward to the immunity case. The Supreme Court held in that case, not that all presidents are above the law, Mark, that Donald Trump is above the law. And you know why I articulate it that way. The Supreme Court decides specific cases. That case was Donald Trump's case, and the question before the court was whether Donald Trump, the former president, could be prosecuted for the grave offenses he committed against the United States of America in and around January 6th. The Supreme Court not only did not decide that question, the only question before it, it decided virtually every other question possible under presidential authority and the constitutional power to prosecute the executive for crimes against the United States. I'm unaware of any other decision in the history of the Supreme Court where the court did anything like that at all. It's a cardinal principle of judicial decision making, especially at the Supreme Court, as you know well, that the court decides only the very, very narrowest issue that it's presented with. And that's for good reason, not least of which is if a court tries to decide all of the issues in the field, by analogy to administrative law or congressional action, by occupying the field, then it is bound to make fundamental constitutional errors in the course of so ruling. And of course, that's exactly what this Supreme Court did. I analogized the case the day it came out to the most ignominious decisions ever decided by the Supreme Court, including Dred Scott, Plessy against Ferguson, and Korematsu. I think the next day, in a conversation with someone, public conversation, I said that in some ways it's worse than those three cases because it did such structural violence to the Constitution of the United States. But in any event, never again can it be said in America that no man is above the law, because the Supreme Court held that Donald Trump is in fact above the law.
Yeah, and it's an odd case, as you said, in the way in which they decided it, because I think it was during oral argument that one of the justices actually sort of batted away the idea that they were just deciding this case and said, we decide cases for the ages, and or for for future presidents. I was thinking, well, where the hell did that come from? You're supposed to decide the case in front of you. And then, it seemed structurally very weird to me that you have the speech or debate clause, which, applies explicitly in the text of the Constitution to the legislature. So showing that the framers knew how to put an immunity clause in the Constitution. They didn't put one in for the president. And yet the Supreme Court actually gives the president more immunity than the legislature gets under the speech or debate clause. It doesn't make any sense to me.
It was almost as if, Mark, and I mean this seriously, that the Supreme Court didn't not even know that Americans had fought the Revolutionary War against the British monarchy in order that America could live by a rule of law under which even the President of the United States would be subject to the laws. It was an abominable decision, is what I called it. And as you know, President Biden called for a constitutional amendment to reverse that case. And the day that he called for the constitutional amendment, I joined him in calling for the constitutional amendment. But the damage is done, and as you know, it's exceedingly difficult to do a constitutional amendment under our Constitution. So it will probably never be overturned.
It's not clear to me, Judge, how it could ever be overturned. Like, who would ever have what would be the fact pattern, right? The Department of Justice is bound by it, so they couldn't bring the indictment. So, what is the way in which it ever actually even could come before the court again?
Well, I was referring to it would not. I was, for your lay viewers and listeners, I was referring to a constitutional amendment to overturn it. But to your question, it's possible. Any case that comes to the court again, if ever, where a president is being prosecuted for a grave crime against the country, that Supreme Court could literally reverse the Trump versus United States and hold, for instance, that the President of the United States is always subject to criminal prosecution for alleged crimes against the United States. But Donald Trump is such a unique figure in American history that I doubt that another president will ever be prosecuted for crimes against the United States, which makes the Supreme Court's decision all the more utterly indefensible.
I'll be back with more of my special conversation with Judge Michael Luttig in a minute, but I want to take this chance to remind you to subscribe to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters. There is no more important time than as we head into the critical post-election period to make sure you are getting accurate, up-to-date information, news, and analysis. The link is in the show notes below and in the link above. So I want to talk to you about your work with the American Bar Association task force. You co-chair its task force on American democracy, we've obviously, you can look at the 2020 election, and one of the things that I think is shocking, at least to me, is how many lawyers wind up figuring into the former president's attack on democracy. We have seen John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani and Kenneth Chesebro lose their law licenses, be suspended or disbarred. There have been indictments. And I'm just curious and I have called on the bars to be much stronger than they have been on these democracy issues. And so tell me what you are doing, what the ABA is doing, and what we need.
Mark, I just joined a Harvard Law class of Professor David Wilkins right before I joined you, and we were talking about this very thing, and thank you for the question. The American Bar Association created what's known as the Task Force for American Democracy in response to the very fact that you alluded to, which is lawyers, many lawyers were involved in that effort to overturn the presidential election in 2020, and they stepped way beyond their role, and of course, a good number of them have been disbarred or will be disbarred, and some of them face criminal prosecution. So it was the ABA's role, frankly, to create this task force. But all the credit for its creation goes to then president of the ABA, Mary Smith, who created it and then peopled it with members, all of whom, Mark, are many of the most distinguished, respected, articulate defenders of American democracy and the rule of law that there are in the country. At the time that they were chosen, roughly a year ago, they were, with a handful of others, they were leading the charge, nationwide. Of course, they've continued to lead it with all their wisdom and their brain power, frankly. And so all toward the end of tomorrow's election, to ensure to the maximum extent possible that we can, as a task force, the integrity of that election. And in our work over the past year, we've coordinated and cooperated with a large number of the other democracy institutions in the country, and we've sort of stitched ourselves together or locked arms together, whatever metaphor you want to use, to first ensure the American people that despite Donald Trump's claims, the 2020 election was the fairest, most secure election in American history, which was demonstrated after the fact by countless audits, recounts, and the like, and that this coming election will be the same, notwithstanding Donald Trump's promise to attempt to overturn that election tomorrow if he loses. The task before the nation, not just before the ABA, in light of the former president's threats, if you will, is a Herculean task. But more importantly, Mark, over the past 4 years, as the president has persisted and continued in his false claims that the 2020 election was stolen from him, when in fact he was the one who attempted to steal it from the American people, and his continuation until this very day, not to agree to the peaceful transfer of power in America, He has corrupted America's democracy and the rule of law. It's just plain and simple. As you know, is better than anyone, the acceptance of the vote and the will of the American people in an election and the faithful agreement by presidential aspirants to a peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next are fundamental tenets of our constitutional republic, without which America would be without a democracy and a rule of law. But nonetheless, millions and millions of Americans will vote for Donald Trump tomorrow, fully aware that he is holding America hostage tomorrow by his threat not to accept the vote and the will of the American people again.
Yeah, and one of the things I have pointed out is that his pathology in this regard is getting worse. He has in 2020 he contested the election results in 6 states: Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Since then, if you listen to his rhetoric in the last 6 months, he has said he won New Mexico twice. He lost New Mexico in 2020 by 11 points. He has said he actually believes he won Minnesota. He lost Minnesota by 7 points. He has recently said he believes if they were accurately counted and there was no fraud, he won California and he won New Jersey. He is actually getting further and further disconnected from reality about the outcome of the 2020 election as we head tomorrow towards Election Day. So, as a former federal court of appeals judge talking to a lawyer and someone who will be dealing with this, as a citizen of this country who has served your country well and has stood up in the face of authoritarianism and its threats, what is your advice? What's your advice to voters? What's your advice to the lawyers? What's your advice as we head towards the conclusion of this election?
Well, as you know, and many of your viewers know, I endorsed the vice president on the first day of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and the announcement was made by CNN. Jamie Gangel, I think, made the announcement, and I'm told that she said, "Once a judge, always a judge," in reference to my 5.5-page single-space letter of endorsement. But it all came to a close with the statement that only Kamala Harris can be trusted to honor her sacred obligations to America's democracy and the rule of law. Donald Trump cannot. And as a consequence of that fact alone, if there were not a myriad of other reasons, Donald Trump is unfit to be president again. And by the same token, the vice president is eminently qualified to be president of the United States tomorrow. And I believe the Americans, especially the women of America, will elect Kamala Harris the first woman president of the United States.
Judge Luttig, thank you for your service to this country. Thank you for your integrity and your willingness, your courage. One of my favorite passages from a Justice Scalia concurrence was in Doe versus Reed, where he talked about the need for civic courage and the need for people to be willing to stand up as citizens and express their views in public. And you are one of the few people who has been as morally clear and as well-spoken as anyone. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's been a real pleasure, and good luck tomorrow.
Thanks for tuning in to this special episode of Defending Democracy. Please make sure you're subscribed to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters. We'll see you next time. Defending Democracy is a production of Democracy Docket LLC.